Today, in the final episode of our series, Know Thyself Questions to Facilitate a Return to Who We Truly Are, I share with you my personal experience of recognizing when the body says no. Our bodies are incredibly wise and will tell us when something needs to change, but it's ultimately up to us whether or not we listen to these very important messages. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the show and to our final episode in the Know Thyself series. And I'm going to finish this series up by sharing my personal experience of when the body says no. So many of you might have been aware of Gabor Mate's groundbreaking book when he put this out called When the Body Says No. And essentially what his book was around was that the body is going to constantly be presenting certain symptoms that we need to pay attention to. And at some point, we usually just keep going and going and going and pushing and pushing and pushing. And eventually, the body will start to speak louder and louder when something needs to change, particularly if we are not taking heed of those symptoms that the body is sharing with us, those hidden messages in the body. And we just keep pushing and pushing and going in a direction that the body is obviously not okay with. And so it's this idea that when the body presents with certain symptoms, we really need to pay attention to them. And I think this is a really important conversation because for me, getting back very much in the body and paying close attention to what the body is telling us is a very important in to our true self. It's paying attention to what's really going on at the essence of who we are, as opposed to trying to push those symptoms away and just carry on with maybe what our ego mind identity is wanting us to do. So it really gets down to what is the body telling me? And then am I listening to it? And if I'm listening to it, what is it pointing to? And then am I in a position where I'm actually going to make some changes that I need to make in my life? So I want to share with you my personal experience, but before I get into that, why I think this is such an important conversation is because I feel like in many ways we've actually been conditioned to completely disconnect from the body. I mean, even look at commercials. Like I saw a commercial just the other day, and it was of this runner running and showing like their throbbing knee pain. And they, rather than stopping running to see what was actually going on, the commercial was to take a specific pain medication that would get rid of it. And you see the red swelling, inflammation, pain kind of disappear. And then they just keep on going. They're running back up the hill again. So rather than paying attention to saying, well, maybe there's something going on that I need to pay attention to, rather than actually doing that and paying attention to what the body's telling us, we're actually told the exact opposite. Ignore it, maybe even consider that information the body's telling us is a weakness that we need to just push through or move past, or take something to dissolve the symptoms of it so that we don't have to pay attention to it anymore, and then just keep on going, despite the fact that there might be a lot of ramifications down the road. They don't show the story that if you stop taking the pain medications, you might be making an underlying problem worse and worse and worse until the point that maybe you even need to have surgery or something along those lines. So in many ways, I think we are very conditioned to not pay attention to what the body is telling us, or even look at it as being a weakness that we need to push past, right? That's a strong position in the modern world, I would say, is that we just need to kind of push past things. And it's not to say that there's not a place for that. There's absolutely a place where we need to harness the will and be able to dig deep and move past things. But we need to be able to discern when is that moving in that direction in a healthy way, and when is it maybe something that's causing troubles for our body. And these can be hard things to discern. I think getting back to the body is a good place to always tell us, because the body generally doesn't lie to us. So my personal experience when this really became evident to me was when I was getting this really bad achiness that was going all around my shoulder, down into the back of my shoulder, and actually started to create like numbness and tingling coming all the way down into my hands and to my fingers. And I remember I would be working with patients doing osteopathy, and before I know it, my entire arm had gone completely numb and I couldn't feel anything. Then it would sort of come back. I'd have this achiness that would sometimes keep me up at night. And, being an osteopath and a naturopathic doctor and all of this stuff, being an RMT from before, I went and got a bunch of work done. I saw chiropractic, I got osteopathy, I got massage therapy done, I did stretches, I was doing home care stuff. And It put a little dent in it. It might have helped a little bit, but it was never long lasting and it never really got to the root of it. And this went on for a few months. And I was like doing all of this work and just trying to, bandage it up enough that I could function. And eventually, a good friend of mine, Ryan Carnahan, who I did an episode with way back on looking at some of the information around how to support cold and flu season. He's a good friend of mine, does a lot of osteopathic work, really great practitioner, practices in a really similar way to I do in many regards. Anyways, he was out visiting me and I got him to check things out. And so he went through and he did a bunch of different muscle testing and checked stuff out. And, I had some imbalances with my muscles and that kind of stuff, which is always important to check. But what he also found was he said, well, the emotion that's coming up for you is over responsibility. And then he just said, how does that sit for you? Where does that resonate or does it not resonate? And so I sat with that for a moment thinking, over responsibility, how does that sit? I'm like, okay, well, recently just got engaged, recently just bought a house, recently just moved into that house with my fiance and my new stepson, and recently just switched my location for my practice. I mean, it was like check, 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 tons of over responsibility that was playing out in my life. And I get this because I know that all the different meridians, they relate to different organ systems, they relate to different emotions. But sometimes when you're in it, you need someone outside to be able to help shine a light on that for you. Because when you're in it, sometimes it's hard to see outside of it. So this was incredibly helpful for me. And all I needed to do was literally hold that up as a bit of a mirror to ask myself, how is over responsibility playing into my life? Can I see maybe what's going on in a different way? Is there certain things that maybe I need to change so that that feeling of over responsibility can drain off a little bit so that I can get off my own back a little bit? So I don't feel like there's so much weight on my shoulders, literally causing achiness and pain and numbness that was even coming on. And what was really fascinating is I sat there, I journaled about it. I just did freehand journaling. So I just brought up that conversation on how is over responsibility playing into my life right now? And I just journaled. No stopping, no thinking about it. It was just a freehand go, go, go. If I ran out of something to say, I would rewrite the same question out again and again. How is over responsibility playing into my life? How is over responsibility playing into my life? Or over responsibility is playing into my life in these ways, blank, blank, blank. And then I would just go again. Once I got another stream of thought, I would go. And I wrote out until literally my arm got tired and I felt a bit of a sigh of relief from it. And I filtered through as much as I could, just paying attention to that and recognizing that my body was trying to share information with me made a huge difference. It was shortly after that, I'd been dealing with that for several months. And it was shortly after that, within probably about 7 to 10 days, it just dissolved and went away. And still to this day, I will get similar feelings that will come up in my shoulder if I am going through that same pattern again. If I'm going through that feeling of over responsibility or I'm carrying too much weight on my shoulders, all of a sudden I will start to get twinges of that same achiness. So now I know how to dissolve it before it ever becomes a problem. What's really interesting is when you think about health, you need to remember that most of the time it's the physical symptoms that bring us in to get something checked out because they're uncomfortable, they're irritating, they start to really affect us. But most of the time, physical symptoms are at the lowest plane when we look at the bodies of health. That's the most material, most physical realm is down here. But there's a lot of more abstract layers of energy that play into us getting symptoms. So there's a vital body which ties with emotions. There's a mental body which ties with how we're thinking in improper patterns of thinking. There's archetypals pattern where we connect with different energies that are very powerful energies. So when we think about people where we want to connect to a feeling of compassion or a feeling of love or a feeling of forgiveness or whatever it might be. And then there's the spiritual body, which is right at the very top. And so if there's disharmony with any of these other layers, they all change the blueprint and they eventually fall into our physical health. And we start to see the material manifestations of these other more subtle energy changes that are going on. So for me, not being able to completely address the over responsibility was starting to play out in my body. And something that's so important to remember about this is that ultimately we are wanting to genuinely create health within the body. So if I did something like I was getting chiropractic and osteopathy massage, if it was purely at that physical level, then likely that would have worked really well and it would have taken it away without any problem. But if something keeps coming back and it's not being resolved, we haven't gotten to the root of it. And the body ultimately wants to get to the root of things. And you know, because then symptoms really dissolve and it feels different. You've kind of gotten above just minimalizing the symptoms of discomfort that we're dealing with. And so if I actually was getting, say, chiropractic and massage and osteopathy, and that completely took it away, but it wasn't at the root of it, that would actually be a disservice to me because it wouldn't have allowed me to connect to the heart of the matter, which for me tied to the over responsibility. And who knows where that would have played out in my life if I didn't address that right there. Was that going to play out and start to create troubles in my marriage? Or is it going to create conflict with my stepson? Or was it going to create impacts in my ability to work if I didn't deal with it and eventually got worse and worse to a point that I couldn't work? Right. So when we start to get these symptoms, it's really important to pay attention to them and nip them in the bud before they become worse and worse and worse. What Gabor Mate said was the body will eventually get to a point where it'll just shut down. You know, if you're on that hamster wheel and going and going and going, and symptoms are getting worse and worse and worse, and you're not addressing them, your body will eventually say enough and it will have a mass shutdown. I really think this is at the heart in some parts to things like autoimmunity and cancers and a lot of other chronic illness. I think a lot of it ties with these more subtle layers of health that are not being addressed. Doesn't mean that we don't treat the physical body. You still have to look at how things are affecting the physical body. But a lot of times that's not the absolute root of the problem. We need to move higher up. So the next thing would be then, how do we start to really pay attention to the body? Because like I said, I think we're very trained to disconnect from the body and not pay attention to it. I remember seeing one patient a long time ago that came in with really severe rheumatoid arthritis. So she came in and I came out to shake her hand to introduce myself, and she just shied away because even the thought of touching my hand brought on severe achiness to her. So we're sitting in the clinic and we're doing our initial assessment, and part of my consultation, I'm trying to find out like what triggers it. When did it start? When do you notice certain triggers that make things worse and exacerbate? These are really important questions. When did it start? And why that's such an important one is because you can often do a timeline where you can go say every year from birth to however old you are, and then make a graph and then look and draw a graph as if you're spiking every time you have a major physical illness or any kind of major physical symptoms, and do a little spike, a graph on time and then intensity, and sort of, when were your big spikes in illness or injury or something happened to the physical body or the mental body. You have a mental breakdown or something along these lines, bad episodes of depression or anxiety, or you have a concussion, or you have some kind of physical injury that happens, or, like for me, my shoulder starts to get really painful and I go numb in my shoulder. You want to put little spikes on a timeline. Then you do an overlapping timeline that rather than physical symptoms, you now look at major stressors. So now you do the exact same thing and you look to see when did you have bigger stressors? Lost a job, had a relationship breakup, lost a family member, lost a friend, whatever it might be, but a major stressor. It's not uncommon that you will see spikes in major stressors up to 6 months prior to a major physical illness. Try it out and see what happens. A lot of times you will find the correlations within that. So that's one way to help bridge this gap between looking at physical symptoms and when is there other pieces that might be playing into it, particularly mental emotional stressors that might have preceded the physical symptoms. The other thing that I think is really important for people to try is start doing an assessment. We always want to see objective and subjective measurements to assess where we are in our life. Subjective measurements are things like, how am I feeling, right? What's going on? Is my symptoms changing? Are they getting worse? What is my body feeling like? It's becoming very aware of how you're feeling and whether or not that's changing. And you can do that by checking in with your body and then objectively giving measurements of what that feels like. One of the easiest ways to do this is get a graph and track specific symptoms, determinants of health. If you look at my book, From Understanding to Knowing, Unlocking Your Path to Optimal Health, in that, it's an ebook that's only, I think, less than $10 on the website. I'll put a link to it. Right at the beginning, there's a questionnaire that goes through a whole bunch of symptoms to basically try to pay attention to what are some of the different symptoms that your body might be presenting, wanting you to take a look at. And then beyond that, it gets into tracking forms that help you look at different determinants of health. So things like, what's your temperature like in the morning and the evening? Do you fall within an optimal zone? What's your energy like on a regular basis between 1 and 10? How many bowel movements are you having? What's your digestion like? What's your stress level like? How's your quality of sleep? How many hours of sleep are you having? These are very good determinants of health. They are very good indicators to tell you if your body's moving in a good direction or if it's moving in a direction that's going to cause more and more troubles. So measuring certain things on a regular basis is a great way to get you back paying attention to what is the body telling you and honoring what the messages are that it's sharing with you. Once you start to become aware of the different symptoms that your body is experiencing, so maybe you're getting low back pain, for example, the next thing would start to be paying attention to is, when does that low back pain really come up? Or a headache, when does your headache get worse? A lot of times we don't even know because we're not paying attention. We just feel like I've always got low back pain, or I always have a headache, or I always seem to have indigestion. But if you actually start to track it, you start to become more objective. You start to look for trends that are taking place, and you start to see patterns. It's not so it's pretty common that a lot of times people will get symptoms where they are getting low back pain, for example, and they think it's just all the time, but then they realize, like, oh, I started tracking and I realized that my back really flared up after I had a conversation with this person, or after I started to think about this, or after I had a phone call around this, or after I ate this specific food, or whatever it might be. It's not until we shine the light of awareness on our symptoms that we start to unravel some of the underlying triggers that might be taking place. Then it ultimately comes back to us on whether or not we're going to make some of these different changes. Now, some of these changes can be very physical changes. They can be, I need to make some changes in my diet. Everybody should run a course of doing a diet diary and track what they're eating, track their symptoms at the end of the day, and track how many bowel movements they're having. Track that on a regular basis and just see, with the curiosity of, is what I am doing in the lifestyle that I am holding right at this point in time, is it working for me or is it not working for me? What is my body saying? Make adjustments and see what starts to change. This would be the first step, I would say, for almost everybody. Track your symptoms, track your diet, and see how that's playing into things. See if you can make any correlations. The more we start to do these processes of self-awareness, the more we genuinely start to know the truth of who we are. There's a lot of times where symptoms will come up and we make a correlation to it, but maybe we're not ready to make that change. It's very common that people might get symptoms like this patient that I saw before with the rheumatoid arthritis. When we were trying to find some of the underlying symptoms, when did things get worse for you? The two biggest triggers were, for her, diet. Whenever she ate gluten and dairy, she would get triggers, and whenever she was spending more time with her husband. A lot of marital conflict. And I asked her, how does she describe how it feels in her body with her arthritis? And the way she described it was, I feel constricted, I feel trapped, I feel like I'm in a cage. This is how she described her symptoms. And then the next question I ask, is there anywhere else in your life where you feel those same sensations, feeling trapped, feeling like you're caged, feeling like you're being restricted or constricted? And then the tears came and she realized how much of that was tied into her life with her husband as well. So then that means, are there changes? That either means counseling, or is the time past and it's just time now to move on? That's up for her to decide. And that's up for every individual to figure out. But the first part is to connect to whether or not those things are actually on the table to even deal with. All right, everybody. I hope you guys get a chance to try some of those exercises. I'll put a link to the ebook there if you're interested in checking that out. But Go through that, do the timeline that I talked about, the physical symptoms and then the stressors and the mental emotional symptoms. That's such an important exercise to do. If you find something, do the diet tracking, do the symptom tracking, see what comes up and see if you can make any correlations. All right, everybody, write me in any comments you have around that. I'd be curious to hear more about that and see if it helps people. All right, take care, and I hope to talk to you soon. Bye-bye.